Imagine being constantly judged, ignored, and rejected for something you cannot change. Now imagine that this prejudice not only tried to destroy your dreams, but also threatened your very identity. But instead of giving in, this person stood up against everything and everyone, defying expectations and proving that true strength comes from within. What seemed like a lost battle turned into a story of overcoming adversity, victory, and justice. Get ready to experience a journey that will touch your soul and show you that sometimes the biggest obstacle is the one you choose to leave behind. In a world where differences often become easy targets for judgment, the lives of many are marked by silent struggles, daily challenges, and often, the unbearable weight of prejudice. Imagine waking up every day feeling like you don't belong, not because your dreams or desires are any different, but because simply being who you are becomes a reason for doors to close, eyes to turn away, and words, no matter how light, become deep wounds. This is the reality for many, like our protagonist, who is the target of discrimination for something beyond their control, something they didn't choose. Our story begins in a small town, where the standards are rigid, and the expectations often stifle any chance for change. Society had already decided everyone's place, and the protagonist, with their unique characteristics, was quickly pushed to the margins. Whether due to their skin color, origin, lifestyle, or even way of thinking, they found themselves trapped in a maze of preconceived notions that seemed impossible to escape. The environment they grew up in was a reflection of a cruel reality. At school, the children, often unaware of the impact of their words, repeated what they saw at home, reproducing patterns of exclusion and, in doing so, perpetuating a cycle that seemed unbreakable. The looks they received on the street, the way teachers treated them, and even the indifferent or mocking stares from strangers, everything reinforced the idea that they would never be enough, never be accepted, and perhaps it wasn't even worth trying. Imagine for a moment being in a place where each step you take is followed by criticism, and where even your greatest achievements are minimized simply because you don't fit the mold. The protagonist of our story wasn't a superhero, didn't possess any extraordinary abilities, and like anyone else, had their weaknesses and insecurities. But they had something crucial, an indomitable spirit, and a vision of the future that no one, no matter how hard they tried, could take from them. Amidst this harsh reality, they refused to be defeated. But the path to this decision wasn't easy. Discrimination didn't appear in obvious forms. It wasn't something they could point to directly, nor was it expressed in loud insults or harsh words. Prejudice came in the small things, the daily actions that, over time, became giant mountains to climb. Like a boat, navigating through murky waters, they felt the weight of society trying to divert them from their true purpose. Every time a mocking glance crossed their path, they felt their self-worth being challenged. Every time an opportunity was denied, they asked themselves, "Why am I not good enough?" The worst part was the constant questioning. Would they ever prove their worth? Would there ever be a place for them in the world, beyond becoming another statistic of failure and abandonment? But instead of sinking into sadness, something began to shift inside of them. They began to realize that the problem wasn't with them. It was with those who saw them through the lens of ignorance. They understood that prejudice was an invisible prison, and that in order to overcome it, they would need to break the chains that held them captive. Our protagonist's story isn't unique, but their journey, this silent daily fight, is what would make them an example of resistance. In many moments, they thought of giving up. They thought about accepting that life was just the way it was, and that they should just fit in and go along with everyone else. But it was at this exact point that their true strength began to reveal itself. They didn't choose the easy path. They didn't choose to hide in the shadow of fear and insecurity. They chose the fight. However, this fight wasn't an isolated battle. It wasn't just a fight against others, but against themselves. They had to learn how to see themselves differently. They had to learn how to not listen to the voices trying to mold them to fit into what the world wanted, but to listen to their own inner voice, the one that urged them to keep going, to not let the standards imposed by society define who they truly were. The environment they grew up in didn't make things easy. Their town was small, with few opportunities for freedom for those who didn't follow the rules. But it was in that restrictive environment, where others saw obstacles, that they began to see opportunities. They realized that prejudice, no matter how strong, didn't have the power to define their destiny. And so, with pain and frustration as fuel, they began their journey of transformation. This is a story about someone who was challenged to fight against something bigger than themselves, society. A fight against prejudice that wasn't only embedded in words, but in actions, choices, and opportunities. A fight that, no matter how difficult it was, would lead them to achieve something greater, the overcoming of themselves, the achievement of their goals, and, most importantly, the redemption of their identity. Now, with everything they had been through, the question arose, would they be able to win? You will find out along this journey. But what we already know is that, with the strength of the human spirit, they weren't willing to just be another victim of prejudice. They were ready to become the protagonist of their own story. From the earliest years of their life, the protagonist began to sense that the world didn't treat them the same way it treated others. At first, everything seemed normal, like any childhood would be. Playing in the street, laughing with friends, and like any kid, an innocent ignorance about what was to come. But slowly, something strange began to infiltrate their everyday life, something they couldn't identify or explain. It wasn't direct, it wasn't obvious, but it was there. Small glances, whispered words, gestures of indifference that seemed to plant tiny seeds of pain in their heart, without them even fully understanding why. They remember the day when they first realized something was wrong. They were at school, a place where everyone should be equal, where education should reflect fairness and opportunity. But instead, they felt the weight of others' eyes on them, a weight that seemed invisible to everyone else but was crushing to them. When they entered the classroom that day, they saw their classmates, subtly pulling away, not with words, but with actions. There was something in their eyes, something that made it clear they didn't belong there, as though their very presence was a mistake. It wasn't the kind of discrimination that came from a direct insult or harsh words. No, it came in the form of small, quiet actions. They weren't called hurtful names, but the way others looked at them, how they avoided sitting next to them, the silence that followed whenever they tried to join a conversation. It all had a weight that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about being excluded. It was as if their very essence was being questioned, disregarded. They weren't enough because they were different. That day, in class, when a teacher scolded a group of students who had been laughing at them in a hushed tone, the protagonist noticed something else. It wasn't just a reprimand. It was the look on the teacher's face. Instead of showing empathy, there was a flicker of impatience, almost as if the teacher was bothered by the situation. They couldn't understand it completely at the time, but they felt something inside them shift. It was as if that moment confirmed their worst fears, that they weren't truly welcome, that no matter how hard they tried, they would always be considered an outsider. These moments, though subtle to anyone who wasn't experiencing them, were like invisible daggers. Discrimination wasn't something that was out in the open. It wasn't something they could point to directly, nor was it expressed in loud, aggressive ways. It was the way people treated them, or more accurately, the way they were treated differently from others. It came in the form of avoidance, exclusion, and silent rejection. The protagonist was constantly faced with this question: why am I not good enough? And it wasn't just at school. It was everywhere. On the streets, at social gatherings, even at family events, the protagonist felt the difference. They weren't just another face in the crowd. They were the other. And that feeling of otherness started to embed itself deep within them, seeping into their self-image. The pain wasn't always visible, but it was there, growing quietly, making them question everything about themselves. It was a battle that no one could see, but one they felt every single day. The most challenging part of this discrimination was that it wasn't as simple as being directly attacked. No one yelled insults at them. No one called them names. Instead, it was in the subtle ways people reacted to their presence, in the ways people would move away just a little bit when they came near. It was the looks that lingered too long, the whispered jokes that felt like arrows piercing through their spirit. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, a reminder that they were always seen as different, as less than. And then, as the protagonist entered their teenage years, the signs of discrimination became even more evident. They had always been a curious, bright individual, eager to show the world their capabilities. But whenever they took the chance, the world seemed to fight back. There was always that look, that judgment. It wasn't always explicit, but it was there. Every time they took a step forward, it was like they were being pushed back, as if the world was telling them, "You don't belong here." It was during one of these moments, when the protagonist spoke up in front of the class about a project they were working on, that the harshness of the world hit them full force. Some of their classmates chuckled, others exchanged glances, and one even sarcastically asked, "You really think you're going to succeed in this?" The hurt was real. It was deep. It wasn't just about the project. It was about them, about their very right to be there. No matter how hard they tried, no matter how much they proved their worth, it seemed that their efforts were always diminished by the invisible walls of prejudice. These moments were the hardest to bear. The protagonist had already felt different, but these instances confirmed that feeling. They were constantly reminded that, despite their abilities, despite their dreams, they would never be seen as equal to others. And that reality, that painful truth, was more difficult to accept than anything else. But, in the face of these quiet injustices, something began to shift inside them. They started to realize that the problem wasn't with them. It was with the people who couldn't see beyond the surface. The prejudice they faced wasn't a reflection of their worth, but of the limitations others imposed on themselves. The challenge wasn't to change the way the world saw them. It was to change the way they saw themselves. And it was in that realization that the first spark of rebellion against the prejudice began to take form. The protagonist hadn't yet figured out how to fight back, but they knew one thing for sure. They were done being defined by the narrow views of others. The real battle wasn't against the people who rejected them. It was against the fear and doubt that had started to settle in their own heart. And so, this marked the beginning of a journey, one that would take them through incredible struggles, but also lead them toward an incredible transformation. The first signs of discrimination had opened their eyes to the world, and in turn, had opened the door to the fight they were about to wage for their future. Every time the protagonist woke up, the feeling that something was wrong became more intense. It was as if the weight of the world was on their shoulders, invisible to everyone but crushing to them. Every morning, they looked in the mirror and for a second asked themselves, "Who am I, really?" It wasn't just the common teenage doubt of trying to understand one's identity. No, this was much deeper, much more painful. It wasn't just about wondering who they were. It was about asking why they were. Why were they different? Why did the world keep reminding them of their differences in such a cold and unwelcoming way? Little by little, they began to realize that their reflection in the mirror wasn't just the image of a person. It was the reflection of everything the world thought of them. Those judgmental glances, those sneers, those awkward silences that came whenever they tried to be a part of a conversation. It was as if they were being shaped, not by their own self-image, but by the perceptions of everyone else. And that's when the emotional weight started to get too heavy to bear. At school, they felt invisible, not because people didn't see them physically, but because they felt their essence was being denied with every glance, every word, and every subtle rejection. It wasn't about being excluded for a single moment. It was about living every single day under the shadow of doubt, under the impression that they would never be accepted. They were starting to believe the lies that the world told them, even if those lies weren't spoken aloud. Those lies crept into their mind and every day chipped away at their self-worth. The hardest part wasn't just the rejection from others. It was the growing belief that maybe, just maybe, they weren't good enough, that they didn't have the right to be there, in the spaces they wanted to occupy. Those tiny slights, those little acts of exclusion, were not easy to define, but they had a tremendous emotional toll. It wasn't just being left out. It was being made to feel like you didn't belong at all, like you were always less than everyone else. At times, when they tried to speak up, to show their skills, to be heard, they were met with silence. It wasn't the loud, overt rejection of being yelled at. It was the subtle dismissal that seemed even more painful. It wasn't always obvious, but it was relentless. And the more it happened, the more it started to eat away at their self-esteem. It wasn't just about feeling invisible anymore. It was about feeling like they didn't matter, like their presence was not enough. Each day they were forced to live through the rejection of others. Their self-image cracked just a little more. Then, the real blow came when their own mentor, someone they looked up to and respected, expressed doubt. The mentor suggested that they weren't quite ready for the opportunities they were pursuing, that maybe they should wait, that perhaps they needed more experience. These words weren't harsh, but they were dismissive. And that dismissal, even when masked as advice, cut deep. It was the final reminder that, no matter how hard they worked, no matter how talented they were still being judged for something beyond their control. The worst part wasn't just hearing the words. It was that feeling that their own mentor saw them as less than what they really were. Every rejection, every bit of doubt piled on top of the others. Each moment was another reason to believe that maybe they didn't belong in the world they were trying so hard to be a part of. The emotional toll was undeniable. The protagonist began to question their abilities, to doubt the value of their ideas. It wasn't just about proving themselves to others anymore. It was about proving it to themselves. The worst battle was not just against external rejection. It was against the internal voice that was starting to win. The voice that whispered that they would never be enough, that they would always be seen as different, as an outsider. Worst part of all of this was that the protagonist had begun to believe that voice. The rejection of others had become internalized, and that internalized pain began to affect every part of their life. But in the midst of this emotional storm, something began to shift. They realized that this constant pain wasn't a reflection of who they were, but of the limitations placed upon them by others. They were being judged not because of their own flaws, but because the world was too narrow in its view of them. The truth was that the problem wasn't with them. It was with those who couldn't see beyond the surface. And as this realization began to take root, they started to understand that the only way to break free from this was to stop letting others' perceptions define their worth. It wasn't going to be easy. The battle was far from over, but the emotional toll started to feel more manageable. The protagonist knew they couldn't keep letting these negative thoughts define them. The fight against the prejudice of the world had to start with one simple act: learning to believe in themselves again. And so, the emotional journey began to shift. What had once been a fight against the world was slowly becoming a fight for self-belief, for reclaiming their own identity. It wouldn't happen overnight, but the first step had been taken. The emotional scars were still there, but they had begun to understand that the true fight wasn't about battling the prejudices of others. It was about fighting the prejudice they had started to internalize. And once they realized that, everything began to change. The weight of insecurity was becoming unbearable. Every step forward felt heavier than the last, as if an immense invisible wall was being built in front of them, blocking any chance of escape, any hope of relief. But on a seemingly ordinary morning, something unexpected happened. Something that, though not grand to the eyes of others, would mark the turning point in their story. They were sitting in their room, their eyes fixed on the window, watching the heavy rain fall, much like the weight they carried inside. And in that moment, something within them simply snapped. Not a break of weakness, but a break in their internal resistance. It was as if they had been crushed by so much for so long that finally they were ready to rise again, even if they didn't yet know how. They no longer wanted to be the person who accepted the cold glances and dismissive words. They no longer wanted to live in constant doubt, questioning if they were worthy of a place in the world. Something inside them began to warm, a silent strength, a voice deep within their soul that, for the first time, said, "Enough. No more being defined by what others thought. No more being imprisoned by the fear of rejection." They didn't know exactly where this strength came from, but they knew it was the only chance they had to rewrite their story. At that moment, they realized something crucial. The world might try to define who you are, but the only person who has the power to do that is you. Life wasn't waiting for them to get better. They had to decide whether they would rise or remain trapped in the shadow of their own insecurities. And it was that decision, that simple yet powerful act of standing up, that would change everything. They began to see themselves differently, no longer as someone who needed to shrink, to adapt to the world's standards. They started to understand that their true strength lay in their difference. In a world that tried to make them conform, they began to take pride in what made them unique. They wanted to be themselves, unapologetically, without worrying about fitting in, because fitting in meant losing themselves. They realized that by accepting their imperfections and embracing what made them different, they weren't just freeing themselves from society's expectations. They were taking the first step toward true freedom. And so, they made a decision. They would no longer wait. They wouldn't wait for doors to open, for opportunities to fall from the sky, or for people to change their minds about them. They would make it happen. They would fight for their life, for their happiness, for their dreams. But this fight wasn't against others. It was against their own fears, their own doubts. They knew the prejudice would still be there, that judgment would continue, but they also knew that from this moment forward, they wouldn't let it define them. The road wouldn't be easy, but they no longer feared the winding path ahead. They remembered the words their grandfather had once told them as a child. Life isn't about how you start, but about how you finish. And in that moment, they knew their journey was only beginning. The end would be different, though. They wouldn't be the same person who had once doubted their place in the world. They would be the one who fought, the one who stood tall despite it all. They had made the choice to fight. But in order to fight, they knew they would have to strengthen not just their body, but their mind. They would have to learn to trust themselves again, to believe in their abilities, and to overcome the ghosts of the words that still echoed in their mind. They knew it wouldn't be easy. They knew there would be massive challenges ahead, but something inside them ignited. And they knew that, for the first time in a long time, they were in control. They were ready to show the world who they really were, without fear, without shame. And the most important thing of all, they were ready to be happy, to achieve their dreams, and to be the best version of themselves, no matter the adversity. This was the decision that would change everything. And with it, they started to realize that the greatest obstacle they would face wouldn't be the prejudice of others, but the prejudice they still carried inside themselves. That was their first victory. The decision to fight wasn't a moment of grandiose triumph. It wasn't a public victory, but it was the first step that would lead to real transformation. And from that moment forward, they knew their journey of overcoming was about to truly begin. They were ready to face whatever came their way because they now believed they deserved something more than the pain of their past. They deserved a life full of accomplishments, respect, love, and, most importantly, self-respect. The fight was only just beginning, but the first victory, the most important of all, had already been won. The decision to fight What no one ever told them about fighting against prejudice, about fighting for their dreams, was that the battle is not just with others. The real war begins within us, and the toughest barriers to overcome are the ones in our own minds. When the protagonist decided to take their first step toward their goals, they knew obstacles would arise, but they didn't expect those obstacles to come from all directions, and sometimes from within themselves. The first challenge came from within, silent, a psychological struggle that no one else could see, but that they felt every day. Every time they took a step toward their dreams, a voice inside their head started to echo. Are you capable? Do you think you can do it? Wouldn't it be easier to just go back to the comfort zone, where you know what to expect? The fear of failure wasn't some distant possibility anymore. It was right there, sitting in the back of their mind, whispering doubts and uncertainties. And the harder they tried to move forward, the stronger that voice seemed to become. They remembered how much they had been doubted in the past, when people laughed at their dreams, when their achievements were always minimized. How could they overcome the fear that all of it was just an illusion? The real battle wasn't about defeating external obstacles. It was about silencing that internal voice, the voice that told them they weren't good enough, that they didn't deserve to succeed, that they didn't deserve their own dreams. Then came the first external obstacle. They had already known prejudice would be part of their journey, but they didn't expect it to come in such subtle, unexpected ways. After some time, they decided to enter an important competition in their field, something that could showcase their talent and open doors for their future. They knew it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but they also knew they would have to fight against the expectations of others who saw them as different. What they didn't expect was the coldness and resistance they encountered from some of their peers who, upon hearing of their participation, began to dismiss their ability. You really think you're going to make it? That's not for people like you, one of them said, with a sarcastic tone. The impact of those words was like a knife to their heart, even though they tried to hide the pain. This wasn't just about the competition. It was about them, about their right to belong. Every new comment, every avoided glance, seemed like another piece of their confidence being chipped away. They knew that the world didn't see them as equal to others, but now it felt like the world was actively trying to push them back. And as if that wasn't enough, the real surprise came when they were confronted by a mentor, someone they respected and admired. This mentor, upon hearing of their plans, suggested, under the guise of good advice, that perhaps they weren't quite ready for such an important challenge, that they should wait until they were more prepared, maybe when they had more experience. They didn't say it directly, but the tone of doubt was unmistakable. This was a blow that stung deeply because it came from someone they looked up to. Instead of being encouraged, they were made to feel as though they weren't capable. Once again, it wasn't about their actual ability. It was about how others saw them, how they were continually judged as less than. This wasn't a fight against a visible enemy, as they had once imagined. It wasn't a war against people who attacked them directly. The true battle seemed to be against society's indifference, those small, invisible barriers that existed in attitudes, in the choices made for them, and in the opportunities they were denied. But then, the biggest challenge of all came, a fight against themselves, a stronger force than any external prejudice. The fear of failure that had always haunted them came rushing back. What if they really weren't good enough? What if, despite everything they had done, they failed? And if they failed, did that mean they never deserved any of it in the first place? Every step they took forward felt like walking on a tightrope between success and failure, and with each step, fear began to consume them a little more. They knew they had to keep going, that they couldn't let these obstacles defeat them, but the barriers kept piling up in a way they couldn't have predicted. At that moment, they realized that they were fighting on multiple fronts. They weren't just fighting against prejudice. They were fighting against the expectations of others, against the way society had decided who was worthy of success, and most painful of all, against the doubts that were growing inside them. But in that very moment, they began to understand something. The real obstacle was not the prejudice of others. The real obstacle was the fear, the doubt, and the insecurity they still carried inside themselves. They were beginning to see that, in order to move forward, they would have to learn to embrace their own mistakes, accept their imperfections, and most importantly, realize that failure was simply a step on the path to victory. The journey was getting harder, the challenges more intense, but at the same time, they were becoming stronger, more resilient. They knew that this battle wouldn't have a quick end, but they also knew that they were getting closer to achieving something that wouldn't be defined by external barriers, but by the strength they were discovering inside of themselves. The darkness of their thoughts seemed endless, but little by little, a new light began to emerge. Every step forward, though small, felt like a triumph over pain and fear. They were no longer waiting for the world to change on its own. The truth was, even with all the difficulties, they were starting to realize something essential. The only person who could change their path was themselves. They remembered something their grandfather had once told them. The greatest enemy is the one inside of you. When you learn to silence it, the world will be yours. This thought stuck with them, constantly echoing in their mind, slowly transforming into a mantra. They had to silence the voices that doubted them, the voices that said they weren't good enough, that they didn't deserve success, that they didn't deserve their own dreams. The world could doubt them, but they had to believe in themselves. And so, they made the decision. They would stop focusing on their failures and start focusing on their strengths. They knew that if they wanted to overcome prejudice and doubt, they had to focus on what they did well, on the things they knew they could do, and use those strengths as the foundation for their journey. They began studying more, not because they had to, but because they were passionate. They dove into books, videos, conversations with experts, learning more, improving every day. What had once seemed like an overwhelming challenge now became fertile ground, ready to be cultivated with their knowledge and ideas. Each new bit of learning was like a step up a ladder, leading to something bigger, something more significant. But it wasn't just technical knowledge that helped them keep going. They realized they needed to strengthen their mind too, to build a confidence they didn't even know they had. They started pushing themselves out of their comfort zone. They entered more competitions, gave more presentations, and sought out more situations where they could be seen, where they could show their value. It wasn't easy. Every time they stood on stage or presented in front of an audience, their heart raced, the fear tried to take over. But instead of letting it paralyze them, they used it as fuel. They wanted to prove to themselves that fear had no control over them. Their determination, which had once been a shy desire for change, began to transform into an unstoppable force. They knew the road would be long, that victory wouldn't come easily, and that prejudice would still be there. But they also knew that from that moment on, they wouldn't let anything define them. They started to understand that the real overcoming wasn't just about achieving external accomplishments. It was about overcoming themselves, about learning to believe in their potential, to stop letting the judgments of others determine their worth. It was at one of these competitions that they had their first real test. They weren't the favorite, and they knew that many were just waiting for them to fail. But as they stood there, silently confident, it wasn't to prove anything to others. It was to prove to themselves that they were capable. And somehow, in that moment, the pressure melted away. They focused on their preparation, their skills, and their true passion for what they were doing. When the final result was announced, no one was surprised to see their name among the winners. But what really changed at that moment wasn't the trophy or the prize. What changed was the way they saw themselves. They had faced doubt, fear, and prejudice, but more importantly, they had overcome their greatest battle, the battle against their own insecurity. They hadn't just achieved something. They had learned to trust themselves again, to trust their skills, and to stop doubting their worth. That was the turning point. Over the months that followed, they became a stronger version of themselves. They were no longer the person who hid behind their doubts. They were someone who understood that true strength didn't come from the absence of fear or failure, but from the courage to keep going despite it. They knew that, with each setback, with each fall, they could rise again. And what kept them standing wasn't the lack of adversity. It was the understanding that they had the intelligence and determination to overcome whatever came their way. They started to stand out, not just for what they achieved, but for the internal transformation that showed in every decision, in every action they took. Their focus became clear, their vision of the future solidified, and as they moved forward, they realized something even more powerful. By starting to believe in themselves, they were helping others believe too. They had become a living example that no matter where you come from, no matter what others think of you, what matters is what you choose to do with the cards life deals you. And so, the journey of overcoming continued. But the protagonist was no longer alone. They now had themselves as an ally. They had found their inner strength, their intelligence, and the determination to move forward, no matter what happened. And from that moment on, they knew that nothing or no one could stop them from reaching what they wanted. The greatest obstacle had been overcome, the belief that they weren't enough. And with that, they were ready to conquer the world. The sound of applause was almost like a distant echo, a feeling they took a moment to recognize. There they were, standing tall, in front of an audience that no longer saw them as the person they once were, the one filled with doubt, fear, and limitations. They were someone else now, someone who had gone through storms, both internal and external, and had come out on the other side stronger. But for them, the true recognition didn't come from those claps. The greatest reward was the silence within, the certainty that finally, they had found their place in the world. Victories began to come one after another, but what truly amazed them wasn't the public recognition, the accolades, or the praise that started pouring in. What really touched them was the way they looked back and saw how far they had come. When they began, they were just a young person filled with doubt, but now they were living their accomplishments with unshakable confidence. They weren't hiding anymore. They weren't waiting to be accepted. They had finally forged their own path, and they were walking it with the courage they had always known they possessed, but had never quite been able to access. It was striking to realize how, little by little, the same people who once doubted their potential, who saw them as an exception, began to look at them differently. They saw someone who had the glow of true transformation. They weren't the insecure young person who was trying to escape the shadow of prejudice anymore. They were an example of strength, courage, and intelligence. Someone who had fought against all odds to get to where they were. When it was time to present their work, they didn't hesitate. With the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, they spoke with passion, with the truth of someone who finally understood their own worth. The moment of triumph came, and the room fell silent. All eyes were on them, but this time they didn't care. Dun-dun-dun. Fear had vanished, replaced by something far more powerful. The pride of someone who had fought for their own redemption. When their name was called as the winner, the feeling of victory was indescribable. But the real triumph wasn't the trophy or the prize. The real victory was knowing that, despite everything, they had overcome the greatest battle of all, the battle against prejudice, both internal and external. But the impact didn't stop there. Their achievement didn't just change their life. It reverberated through those around them, through those who had witnessed their journey, through those who were also fighting to overcome what others thought of them. They were no longer an exception. They were now living proof that, no matter how hard the world tries to limit us, true greatness comes from within. And perhaps most importantly, they knew that their fight wasn't over. Their victory wasn't the end of their journey. It was the beginning of something much larger, a movement that would show everyone, especially the next generation, that nothing is impossible when we believe in our own value. Society around them began to shift too. The small barriers of prejudice, the ones that seemed invisible and insurmountable, began to break down, even if slowly. They didn't want to be a hero, but now they understood that, in a way, they had become an inspiration. And this recognition, this impact, was deeper than any applause. They were finally making a difference. But the greatest transformation, the greatest redemption, was inside them. They had reached a point where others' opinions no longer held the same weight. It wasn't that they didn't care about people anymore. They had learned that worrying about what others think is natural, but it shouldn't be the deciding factor in our choices. They began to see that, while others now saw them as someone full of talent and ability, they were still only beginning to explore how far they could truly go. The judgments of others, which had once consumed them, began to fade away. Not because people changed their minds, but because they finally understood that what others thought no longer defined them. They no longer needed the approval of anyone to know their own worth. They were no longer the reflection of the cruel words or the indifference they had suffered. They were proof that, no matter how difficult it was, adversity could be overcome, and that they had the power to write their own story. And looking back, they realized that the greatest gift they received from this entire journey wasn't the title or the prize. It was the moment they started to believe in themselves again, when the opinion of others ceased to be a prison and became just a distant observation. They knew, without a doubt, that the next steps would be even greater. They were ready to take on the world. This was the true essence of victory. It's not about what the world gives you, but about what you are able to achieve when you decide to stand up and fight, when you decide that others' opinions will no longer dictate your life. And the most beautiful part of it all was that, by winning, they inspired others to do the same. Their fight hadn't just transformed them, it had helped transform the world around them. If you're feeling inspired by this story of overcoming, if you believe you can achieve your own dreams, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can continue this journey of transformation. Because remember, your story could be the next one to inspire the world. The day had come. The day when all the years of struggle, overcoming, and resistance transformed into something tangible, something real. What once seemed impossible, what was constantly minimized by external voices, and even internal doubts, finally materialized in front of them. The protagonist stood before the biggest opportunity of their life, an international competition where the brightest minds in their field would gather to assess the world's most promising talents. Throughout the journey, they had faced challenges that tested them to their limits. With each step, they had to battle the ghosts of their past, the fear of failing, and the prejudice that, even in its subtle form, always tried to make them feel like they didn't deserve to be there. But at that moment, as they prepared to give their best, they felt something they had never felt before, a quiet confidence. It wasn't just about winning. It wasn't about proving anything to the world. It was about proving to themselves that the impossible had always been within reach. They were no longer trying to fit into someone else's expectations. They were there because they had earned their place with their own hands. When the event began, the same people who had once doubted their abilities started to look at them with different eyes. They saw someone radiating the glow of true transformation. They were no longer the insecure young person, trying to escape the shadow of prejudice. They were now an example of strength, courage, and intelligence, someone who had fought against all odds to get to where they were. When it came time to present their work, they didn't hesitate. With the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, they spoke with passion, with the truth of someone who had finally recognized their own worth. The moment of victory arrived, and the room fell silent. All eyes were on them, but this time, they didn't care. The fear had vanished, replaced by something much more powerful, the pride of someone who had fought for their own redemption. When their name was announced as the winner, the feeling of triumph was indescribable. But the true victory wasn't in the trophy or the award. The real triumph was knowing that, despite everything, they had overcome the greatest battle of all, the battle against prejudice, both internal and external. But the impact didn't end there. Their success didn't just change their life. It rippled through those around them, through people who had witnessed their journey, through those who were also fighting to rise above what others thought of them. They were no longer an exception. They had become living proof that no matter how hard the world tries to limit us, true greatness comes from within. And most importantly, they understood that their fight wasn't over. Their achievement wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning of something far greater. A movement that would show everyone, especially future generations, that nothing is impossible when we believe in our own value. The world around them began to shift too. The small barriers of prejudice, those invisible and seemingly insurmountable walls, began to break down, even if slowly. They didn't want to be seen as a hero, but now they knew that in a way they had become an inspiration. And this recognition, this impact, went far beyond the applause. They were finally making a difference. But the greatest transformation, the greatest redemption, came within. They had reached a point where the opinions of others no longer held the same weight. It wasn't that they no longer cared about people, but they had learned that while worrying about what others think is natural, it shouldn't dictate our choices. They started to realize that, while others now saw them as someone full of talents and abilities, they were still just beginning to explore how far they could truly go. The judgments that once consumed them began to fade, not because people changed their minds, but because they had finally understood that what others thought no longer defined them. They no longer needed anyone's approval to know their own worth. They were no longer a reflection of the cruel words or indifference they had once suffered. They were living proof that, no matter how hard it is, adversity can be overcome, and that they had the power to write their own story. And looking back, they realized that the greatest gift they received from this entire journey wasn't the title or the award. It was the moment they began to believe in themselves again, when the opinion of others stopped being a prison and became a distant observation. They knew, without a doubt, that the next chapters would be even greater. They were ready to take on the world. This is the true essence of victory. It's not about what the world gives you, but about what you achieve when you decide to stand up and fight, when you choose not to let others' opinions define your life. And the most beautiful part of it all is that, by winning, they inspired others to do the same. Their fight didn't just transform them, it helped transform the world around them. Now, if this story has touched you, if you feel inspired and believe you can overcome your own challenges, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can continue this journey of transformation. Because remember, your story might be the next one to inspire the world.